In 2010, the petroleum sector accounted for 26% of Norway's total income and 47% of total exports. We tell ourselves that without oil, we'd be poor. We practically worship the petroleum industry here in Norway. If oil is the reason for our high standard of living, then where's Sweden's oil? Why are they comparable to us when they have no oil fund? Is our national worship of oil really deserved? And did we really become rich in the 1970s when oil extraction in the North Sea began in earnest? I don't think so. I think that what made Norway rich is a much more complicated picture. The story of Scandinavian prosperity is a story of class struggle transformed into class collaboration, of young revolutionaries becoming old men, wielding the powers of the state to illegally surveil and spy on those who 40 years prior would have been their comrades. For good or ill, the story of Norwegian prosperity cannot be divorced from the story of the Norwegian Labour Party, but also Norway's other natural resources, and its sometimes fortunate historical circumstances. Speaking of shady surveillance, everything you do on the internet is logged. Any data you share could be sold to third-party data brokers who can sell it to landlords, employers, or insurance companies. Luckily, there are legal avenues to remove this information. Like in the EU, you've got the GDPR. I've tried to manually have my data removed before from a weird payment processing service, and it was a pain in the ass. Not to mention that's one company I knew had my info. There's many others I don't know about. That's where Incogni comes in. Thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Incogni analyzes information that you provide, locates it at these various information brokers for you, and then sends a lawful request on your behalf to have the information about you suppressed or removed. I signed up with my information and immediately the service told me of 43 information brokers who had my info. Then moments thereafter, 13 of these requests to have my data removed were completed, and 5 brokers were never going to collect my data again. According to Incogni's rough estimate, had I done this manually, it would have taken almost 10 hours of effort. I returned to check back 2 days later. 17 requests were now completed and 26 in progress. Now granted, I'm a bit more of a private individual than some of you, but when looking this up, I saw anecdotes of people being removed from over 100 such data brokers. From this point on, Incogni will continually send requests to have my information removed. The entire process took about 2 minutes on my end. Now my future landlord should have a harder time doing a background check on me. And should this YouTube thing not work out, my future employer won't already know the answer to why there's a 3-year gap in my resume. So if you're interested in Incogni, use my link incogni.com/Freda for 60% off on the annual plan subscription. That's Freda, but with one D, Freda. Or you can click the link in the top of the description. Just make sure to use the discount code Freda or Freda with one D for 60% off. Norway under Denmark, also called Denmark-Norway, was strongly integrated into European markets over the course of the relatively peaceful 1700s. Norway is a country well endowed with a lot of resources suitable for export, like fish, lumber, iron, copper, and silver. Norway's reliance on exports for its economy was only beaten by one European country, the Netherlands, who were more reliant on exports than any other country in Europe. One estimate by Tvete sees approximately 30% of Norwegian production being exported around the year 1800, though Sandvik points out that this estimate may be high, and does not adequately account for women's contribution to the economy. By 1800, approximately 20 to 25% of Norway's caloric intake was accounted for by imports of grains. In the middle of the 1700s, almost all arable land in Denmark belonged to 800 estates, owned mostly by Denmark's powerful landowning class. In 1733, the Danish state instituted a serfdom-like institution called stamsbåndet, which restricted men to the land that they were born on. Importantly, this law only applied to Danish lands. As such, it did not affect Norway. Norwegian society was, according to Sandvik, presumably poorer, though simultaneously more egalitarian. Similarly, there were more protections for the peasantry, which made it harder for private owners to squeeze profits out of land they were renting out to the peasants. Thus, according to Sandvik, investing in arable land became less attractive, and many private landowners sold off their land over the course of the 1700s. By 1801, 2/3 of Norwegian peasantry owned their own farms. The Napoleonic Wars and Denmark-Norway's entry into the war on the side of Napoleon caused significant strain on the import-export dependent Norwegian society. Napoleon's continental system was not very beneficial to a seafaring nation which barely felt like a European continental country at all, and who was heavily dependent on trade with Britain. In 1814, after the war had turned against Napoleon and Denmark-Norway found itself on the losing side, the King of Denmark-Norway was forced to hand over Norway to Sweden. Following this, Norway very briefly rebelled against Sweden in a short war in which a Norwegian constitution was ratified. Quoting Sandvik, translation mine. Over the course of a year, Norway won peace, internal autonomy, and Europe's most democratic constitution. From 1814 and onwards, all tax and tariff incomes would be spent on developing Norway, instead of being shipped off to an imperial metropole. The development of a Norwegian state apparatus would have tremendous consequences for the Norwegian economy. In 1842, the British Parliament enacted Prime Minister Robert Peel's Free Trade Budget, which relaxed or completely removed tariffs on all sorts of trade goods, among them lumber. In 1849, Britain abolished its Navigation Act, allowing foreign shipping to carry goods between Britain and its trading partners, meaning Norway's tremendous merchant fleet could now take freight jobs between London and Lisbon, for example. While the rest of the world was liberalizing, Norway followed suit, but there was also a desire for the state to take an active role in modernization and development of Norwegian society. Importantly, when we're discussing the liberalization in this period, we're talking about removing barriers to trade and economic activity in the traditional sense, such as removal of tariffs and so on. But we're also talking about abolishing outmoded systems of privileges which had encouraged monopolization. In Norway, the state's investment in, among other things, healthcare and education increased tenfold from 1835 to 1860. In 1860, amidst the construction of the railways, a quarter of the entire budget went to these sorts of endeavors. This stands in contrast to Britain, where the politicians were hesitant to invest and, among other things, its infrastructure construction, such as the expansion of the rail network, was largely handled by private actors. Expansion of infrastructure and modernization of important sectors like healthcare and education did nothing to curtail the further development of Norwegian capitalism. In fact, it supercharged it. Rune Slagstad described the ideology of Norwegian officials at this time as a collectivistically modified liberalism. The economist and Minister of Parliament Anton Martin Sveigard, perhaps the most influential politician at the time, often stressed that the primary purpose of the economy was to facilitate increased wages. The first large-scale factories in Norway were textile mills built in the 1840s. The largest sector in terms of employment was in wood products, including sawmills, and from the 1870s, wood pulp products. The sector generating most capital for investment was, according to Knut Heidar, probably shipping. Much of industry was built around waterfalls where one could build hydroelectric plants to power the factories, providing cheap energy. This, combined with Norway's natural resources, allowed for a competitive advantage that Knut Heidar says remained, quote, for the rest of the century. In the mid-1700s, social inequality was of course pronounced in Norway like in most other places, but according to Sandvik, the so-called economic middle strata was the largest in Norway, and Norway was more economically egalitarian than France, Britain, and Sweden. This began to change in the 1800s as Norway's economic prospects bettered. As is often the case in history, when a country economically does well, it is generally the rich that reap the largest rewards. The reason economic development in the period led to increased inequality is that the property upon and with which wealth was created was privately owned by the relatively richer capital-owning class. Increased profits means increased returns to the capitalist. The worker or smallholder doesn't have the same opportunity to reap profits or collect rent with which to invest, so their gains from an economic boom will necessarily be much smaller. As such, economic development led to an increasing divide between the upper and lower strata of Norwegian society. Though Sandvik does stress that the upper class also grew, with social mobility from middle to upper classes still being possible. Another factor noted by Sandvik that led to an erosion of the egalitarianism of Norway was rapid population growth outpacing available arable land. This led to a proletarianization of the Norwegian lower stratas. Sandvik concludes that while it's difficult to say anything definitively with certainty about the developments towards more social inequality in the 1800s, what can be said is that social inequality did increase until the 1860s. By 1900, Norway was a moderately industrialized country, behind Britain and Germany, but on par with the Netherlands and ahead of most countries in southern and eastern Europe. Norway had little in the means of overseas territories or colonies, so, according to Sandvik, its internal development received more political attention. Due to hostility towards the idea of paying taxes, much of the state's coffers came from tariffs and fees on goods like alcohol. The expansion of the rights of voting to the lower strata of Norway changed Norwegian politics dramatically. When the Norwegian Labour Party was founded in 1887, one of its primary demands was that the tariffs on necessary consumer goods be abolished and replaced with a progressive tax collected by the state. In an effort to maintain its hold on power, the Liberal Party instituted social reforms that met some of the demands of the Norwegian left. In 1895, Norway got its first progressive taxation, whereby the rich would pay a higher tax percentage than the poor. The highest tax percentage was a modest 4%. In 1892, the workers got their first protections, which included restrictions on the use of child labor, making it illegal for children under the age of 14 to work more than 6 hours a day. Looking to Germany for inspiration, Norway instituted welfare funds, providing for those who had experienced workplace accidents. This reform was carried out by a bourgeois, meaning right-wing party, in service of maintaining its hold on power in the face of a growing left. In Rasmussen and Knutsen's Reforming to Survive, they formulate an argument that states that economic elites, the bourgeois party in this instance, representing its capitalist and land-owning constituency, resist the calls for reform from workers. However, when truly threatened, they will adopt elements of the workers' program to avert even worse fates. I say this to emphasize that many of the developments that occurred in Norway were not exceptional to Norway or Scandinavia, and that Norway took inspiration from other countries which were far more progressive on these issues. I want to emphasize that Norway did not end up on any special path of development, different from that of other countries in Europe, which they were unable to embark on. The success of Norway was not contingent on events long in the past. However, historical continuities can be observed. There was also an arena in which Scandinavia was somewhat exceptional, and that's education. Based on Lutheran Protestant teachings, all were to be able to read the Bible in their own language, which meant that all children must be taught how to read. Schooling was considered a responsibility of the public. However, there was a dark underside to this, as the Norwegian state took a rather liberal approach to the own language part and demanded that the Sami, Norway's indigenous population, read the Bible in Norwegian. Investment in the Norwegian education system became an integral aspect of Norway's campaign of ethnic cleansing against its indigenous population. As a result, very few Sami have Sami names, and some of the Sami languages are spoken by only a handful of people. Wealthier countries like Great Britain and the Netherlands instituted universal schooling in the 1870s and 1880s, a whole 150 years after Denmark-Norway. Universal schooling led to a significant increase in women employees and employers. While Norway did see significant growth in the entry towards the 1900s due to factors like women entrepreneurs and workers, new production methods, increasing prices on Norwegian exports, and falling prices on imports, Norway was still developing slower than many other countries. Even so, real wages grew more in Norway than in other countries as prices on consumer goods fell, wages for manual labor grew, which increased the living standard of the Norwegian working class. The rich ended up possessing a lower amount of the total taxable wealth in Norway. Norway was becoming more equal economically speaking. But Sandvik does stress, inequality was still high. It was still there. He says Norway's inequality at this time, viewed with hindsight, had an almost Latin American dimension. Between 1905 and 1914, Norway's GDP grew by 30%. This was on par with the growth of the United States of America. While international trade broke down and economic hardship visited many of the warring nations of the Great War, the nominally neutral Norway was not as affected. According to the numbers, over the course of the period from 1905 through the war and until 1920, the Norwegian GDP grew by a whopping 60%, more than any country in Western Europe. Sandvik does caution that the statistical material existing from the period is somewhat lacking and the real growth may have been somewhat lower. Still, this is an absurd rate of growth. By 1920, Norway was Europe's 10th richest country, and almost at the same level as France, Sweden, and Germany. That's 49 years before the discovery of oil in the North Sea. Technological improvements allowed Norway to tap into its most valuable natural resource yet. Not oil, gravity. Well, specifically the downwards flow of water. In a time when electricity was scarce and expensive, Norway had more electricity available than any other nation. Electricity generation revolutionized Norwegian industry. Electric lighting was better, more consistent, and safer than alternatives, which is immensely important in a country that is coated in darkness for about 30% of the year. By 1916, Norway had the world's largest hydroelectric plant, at Haugan, and by 1920, Norway used 12 to 13 times as much power per capita as the European industrial heartland countries of Britain, France, and Germany. According to Sandvik, the total electricity consumption of the country of the Netherlands was just half of what was utilized by the Norwegian company Heidar's factories at Haugan and Notodden. It cannot be overstated how ahead of the rest of Europe Norway was when it came to electricity, and how important this was for industrial development. By 1920, 2/3 of all households were electrified. Compare this to Britain, where 1 in every 6 households were electrified. Today, the vast majority of electricity production in Norway is hydroelectric. Here's a somewhat outdated graph that illustrates it compared to the other Nordic countries. The liberal mindset towards deregulation and market liberalization waned. Between 1906 and 1917, Norway instituted its concession laws. Concession means the state must permit someone to purchase or utilize natural resources. The 6 expressed goals of the concession laws were: 1. Prevent foreign ownership from dominating the Norwegian economy. 2. Ensure a long-term state or public ownership of natural resources. 3. Prevent monopolization in business related to natural resources. 4. Ensure adequate conditions in labor lodging camps and in new industry towns. 5. Facilitate Norwegian companies providing machinery to the new industries. And 6. Provide income for the state and municipalities through concession fees. As opposed to many European countries, Norway emerged from the First World War richer than it had been before the war began. However, not all social strata benefited equally from this growth. Prices were increasing for those consuming food and goods, while profits increased as well for those producing them. This feeling is likely familiar to many after grocery stores prices jumped after the COVID-19 pandemic, and energy prices jumped after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, while profits also grew. During this period, the Norwegian working class, represented by the labor movement, had largely favored a path of reform towards a socialist society. There was a feeling that the universal vote would allow the working class to vote in their class interest, and therefore carry out necessary societal transformations. Through a process of radicalization, the reformist wing became opposed by 2 groups: the Marxist group, which eventually would look to the revolution in Russia as a blueprint, and the so-called labor opposition, with syndicalist and anarchist tendencies, believing strikes to be an effective revolutionary tool. Under the leadership of Martin Tranmæl, this is the wing that came to lead the Labour Party during this period of radicalization, and would lead it all the way through to the Second World War. The prevailing attitude in the Labour Party at the time was that Norway was not yet ready for revolution, and that it was the duty of the Labour Party to prepare her for when a revolutionary wave could spread to Norway from the rest of Europe. Stugge cites Per Mauset, a historian, socialist left politician, and professor, whose view was that had they believed that the conditions were right, the Labour Party would have carried out a socialist revolution in Norway. I agree with this conclusion based on all evidence that I saw during my research in the Royal Archives of Norway, in Oslo, in which I investigated the surveillance reports compiled by the military on the activities of the Labour Party in this period. Much of the surveillance was illegal. None of this directly led to Norway becoming rich, but it's important to note that this part of the story, and the people who stepped into this movement and would lead it, played a big part in the building of Norwegian wealth, for good and bad. After the war, much of Norway lay in ruins. There's a lot to be said about this period in Norway's history, and someday I will make a video on it, on collaboration and resistance in occupied Norway. After the war, Einar Gerhardsen of the Labour Party was given the task of steering Norway's reconstruction at the helm of a broad unification government representing all parties of Norwegian politics. Even the Communist Party of Norway were given 2 ministerial posts. Einar Gerhardsen himself had been a communist in his younger years. At the first election, the Labour Party received a total majority. The Norwegian Labour Party would be in government from 1945 to 1963, in which the right wing took power for a single month, before Labour was back in charge until 1965. From then on, the Labour Party had less of a complete hold on Norwegian politics. The program for rebuilding Norway was called Fellesprogrammet, or the Common Program, or the Joint Program in English. It was co-signed by every political party during the war. One part read, translation mine, "The task of business and all economic activity in the country is to create work for all and increase production, so that through a fair distribution of results we may give everyone good living conditions." Both socialists and liberals viewed these developments as stepping stones towards a socialist society, one with enthusiasm, the other with apprehension. The end result of the program and subsequent politics was a compromise which preserved private property rights and the ability of bourgeois interests to carry out profit-seeking as they had, but with regulation to provide worker protections and certain redistributive mechanisms in society, safety nets and such. The end result was not socialism, but what the British Beveridge Commission in 1942 had labelled the welfare state. The strongest impetus against regulation and state ownership, however, came not from within, but from the United States of America. A precondition for accepting martial aid from the United States, a necessity for rapid reconstruction, was that the Norwegian economy had to be opened up far more than the government had originally planned for. The direct result was, according to Stugge, that the ambition of a planned economy as opposed to a market-oriented one had to be tempered. However, one aspect of the initial ambition survived, the idea that long-term economic development should be guided by the state with the long-term welfare of the nation and its people in mind, not on the basis of short-term profit-seeking. The state had overarching control, but the market was given access when it aligned with the long-term goals. Profit and private ownership persisted, while short-term profit-seeking at the expense of these long-term plans was curtailed somewhat. Although corporatism didn't fully take hold, aspects of its spirit still persisted in the form of the new regime of social economists and pervasive class collaboration. The modernization and rebuilding of Norway needed expertise. Nowadays, virtually every government minister has at least one undergraduate degree, most often, it seems, a master's degree in something or other. Quoting Rune Slagstad. On the ruins of revolutionary Marxism, socialism was transformed into a reformist technocratic governing ideology, anchored in the national state apparatus. The post-war years began with plans of a socialist development, and ended in a capitalist welfare state. With the Labour Party eventually choosing to bring Norway into NATO, by the entry to the 1950s, Norway was squarely in the Western sphere of influence. Communists were now facing surveillance by the government led by Einar Gerhardsen, a former communist. By 1970, Norway was the largest exporter of aluminium in Europe, and the world's largest exporter of several alloys and ferrous metals. Between 1946 and 1973, gross national product tripled in real terms, though this was about on par with the rest of Europe, ahead of Britain but behind West Germany. From 1950 to 1973, the Norwegian GDP increased by an average of 4.2% per year. Growth continued even after 1973, when oil prices quadrupled in short time, leading to severe global economic instability. The Norwegian state continued to exercise an active role in the Norwegian economy. By 1960, the state controlled 1/5 of all share capital. By 1971, 3 of the 5 largest industrial companies were under government ownership, and these were still being managed somewhat along the principles of the Common Program established before the end of the Second World War. That is to say, for the common good. In 1950, 420,000 people were without electricity. By 1970, this number was down to only 1,000. Despite external pressure, the Norwegian economy was still managed principally by Norwegian authorities. esteemed Norwegian sociologist Stein Rokkan formulated a theory of, quote, corporative pluralism to explain the function of Norwegian governance. In his theory, there are two avenues towards institutional power in Norway. One, a corporative channel through the associations and organizations in which many decisions were made, and the other through the democratic parliamentary channel. Then finally, just before industrial growth in the developed world began slowing down after 1973, Norway found oil. Remember the concession laws we discussed that were instituted in the early 1900s? Norway didn't have the capital or technical expertise to carry out undersea oil extraction at the time, a far more expensive endeavor than oil extraction on land. As such, some private actors had to be given access to the oil reserves. Historically, this sort of development has led to foreign capital essentially looting a country's natural resources. To avoid this, the Norwegian state required that foreign companies train and engage Norwegian companies, instead of relying on existing infrastructure, for example in the UK, for extraction. Through the concession laws, Norway maintained its control of this valuable natural resource while necessary expertise and capital was being developed. A state-owned corporation called Statoil was founded, and by 1981 it was capable of producing oil in competition with the international corporations. With the discovery of oil, Norway returned to its old role as an exporter of raw goods that it had in the 1800s, at the beginning of our story. After oil prices quadrupled with the start of the First Gulf War, Norwegian balance of trade for the first time ever favored Norway. That is to say, Norway was exporting for a higher net return than it was importing. However, rising oil prices had devastating effects on the global economy, so while Norway was for the first time exporting more than it was importing, unemployment also grew. Being reliant on export of a single resource has caused speculation about Norway potentially suffering the, quote, Dutch disease or a resource curse at some point in the future. According to Cappelen in Sangold and others, Norway faces inherent economic contradictions due to its petroleum reliance. Increases in oil prices, in oil findings and so on are favorable to the industry, favorable to the state budget, and favorable to the strength of the Norwegian currency. However, other export-dependent industries like fish, for example, are harmed by a strengthened currency, as they face greater global competition due to the relative value of currencies, meaning what's good for petroleum exports can be bad for all other exports. Investment in petroleum extraction can mean a lack of investment in other domestic ventures that may be more sustainable. Petroleum activities were responsible for 29% of all CO2 emissions in Norway in 2009. A focus on green energy isn't doing much to alleviate petroleum emissions, as our energy grid is already green, though it can aid in the wider European green shift by exporting excess energy abroad to Central Europe. All of this is important to stress because oil is not the economic panacea that some may believe it to be, and while it of course increased GDP drastically and led to all sorts of transformations of Norwegian society, among them the oil fund, some of these transformations may not be sustainable. Norway experienced growth on par with other countries in Europe. It was well endowed with natural resources that other countries lacked, such as its rivers and waterfalls that could be exploited for primitive hydropower and then later electricity. Norway experienced many favorable strokes of luck, such as the handover from Denmark to Sweden in 1814 and the autonomy that came with it, or its ability to conduct trade as a neutral country during the Great War 100 years later. The discovery of oil can be framed as one such stroke of luck. Many countries are well endowed in natural resources, some with far better oil reserves such as Venezuela, but don't find themselves in the same fortunate position as Norway. Comparing and contrasting countries to figure out, quote, where it went wrong is a complicated endeavor, but there's one overarching pattern I think one could easily observe, and that is the global south and the global north divide. It just so happens that resource-rich countries in the global north tended to prosper, while resource-rich countries in the global south prospered less. The question then, I think, shouldn't be how did Norway become rich, but why did Norway stay rich? How was Norway able to keep up with the countries like Great Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States while others were not? Norway was never colonized the way the global south was. Norway gaining autonomy over its internal development coincided with the industrialization of Europe. As Norway was able to better harness its natural resources for a competitive advantage, Norway was not prevented from also asserting its sovereignty over those natural resources. Norway's resources were never looted. After the Second World War, when the Labour Party found itself facing a capitalist superpower beyond the Atlantic in the west and a socialist superpower in the east, they apparently chose the winning team. There are many counterfactuals here, turning points, where it all could have gone wrong for Norway. Norway could have found itself in the socialist bloc, and after its collapse ended up much like many post-Soviet states who had the superpower they became reliant on pulled out from under them. Or Norway could have, in addition to becoming a part of America's strategic military alliance, also been economically subjugated to it, to a greater degree than we already were. Our concession laws could have been eroded. Multinationals could have asserted ownership over our natural resources. Another such turning point came when Norway asserted its sovereignty over its present-day territorial waters, and again in negotiations with the European Union. The recurring theme is sovereignty over natural resources, something many countries were violently prevented from asserting. If a Norway without oil can exist, then what's the future of oil look like in Norway? According to both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, the two major ruling parties for now in Norwegian politics, Norway will continue to explore for oil, virtually guaranteeing that oil extraction won't end until the 2100s, or until a global political response to climate change forces our hand. Cappelen, who I mentioned previously in this video, compiled a report on behalf of the Norwegian Climate Foundation. The report released on the 11th of September this year and delved into the open question of the economic repercussions of continued oil exploration, and comparing it with halting the oil exploration. The report concludes that an early halt in petroleum activity will have less of an impact on the Norwegian economy than should we delay. The reason for this is that it would redirect investment faster towards other ventures while we are still extracting sizable amounts of oil to offset the loss of economic activity that an exploration halt would cause. Cappelen says that continued exploration for more oil would likely provide 1% more funds for Norwegian welfare on a permanent basis than if we should stop. The Norwegian Offshore Directorate, subordinate to the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy, came to very different conclusions on the 11th of March in response to a Parliamentary Climate Committee's report on the same question. The Directorate's Director of Communications, that is, its head of PR, concluded that production would naturally diminish from 2025, even with continued exploration. They highlight the importance of the petroleum industry for Norwegian jobs, and they stress that the energy crisis following the Russian invasion of Ukraine has, quote, shown how important stable gas exports from Norway to Europe are. In 2018, the majority state-owned petroleum company Statoil changed its name to Equinor as part of its future-oriented rebranding as an energy company as opposed to a petroleum company. Greenpeace Norway highlighted that in 2023 only 0.15% of Equinor's energy production was renewable. 80% of its investment was in fossil fuels, and its emissions increased by 3% as a result of increased oil and gas production. Equinor puts out paid articles in Norway's largest newspapers and publishes podcast episodes which are also advertised in said newspapers. For example, this ad from Aftenposten, in my opinion Norway's largest right-wing newspaper, talks about how Nrk.no was intensely critical of the petroleum industry before she started working at Equinor, and now sees the importance of the petroleum industry in the shift towards net zero emissions. There are lots of reasons we've told ourselves oil made us rich. Our state-owned petroleum company's PR department certainly plays a role. But so does the everyday myth-making we do and the way we teach history to kids in school. And everybody loves an underdog story, about how plucky Norwegian entrepreneurs managed to secure vast oil reserves for the benefit of the people, against the combined weight of international capital. In 1920, Norway was the 10th richest country in Europe, 49 years before finding oil. We were already rich. We just became richer. Thank you for watching, and special thank you to the patrons. I haven't released videos in a bit, and that's not too unusual for my channel, but I did also take a quick vacation to England with my girlfriend, my first holiday abroad in about a decade. We visited pretty much every museum we had time to visit. You're seeing some pictures of that on screen right now. Before I go, I want to say a special thanks to Rowan M, Lebeau, Vishire, Jordan M, and Monday's Last Brain Cell. Thank you all so much for watching.